Much like the Loch Ness Monster, the hunting community has its fair share of mysterious folklore, beasts cut from a cloth so rare that they're spoken of through generations, endlessly echoing through the annals of time until they're finally caught. However, the cases where these beasts of legend are captured are slim to none. In this case, we don't particularly mean creatures hanging on the fringes of reality like Bigfoot or the Wendigo, more on the line with a chupacabra, something with consistent documentation throughout generations. Regarding today's topic, there's big game in the Northeast, and it straddles the line between physical and spiritual. No one knows what it is or how it even exists, but it's there, and it's seemingly been there since the late 19th century. Collectively, no one often thinks of Maine when cryptids or strange happenings are brought up in discussion. Much like every state in the US, they do have their own Bigfoot, known as the Kiwakawa, although this one has a taste for human flesh during the winter rather than flee from people like most of them. Black Panthers residing in Maine are also an interesting point of discussion, considering how strange and out of place they'd be so far away from their natural habitat. The belief that wild black panthers roam that region, in general, is widely debunked, explained away by animals affected with melanism, or a genetic condition causing a creature's fur to become black. The thing is, similar felines could have easily been mistaken for panthers because of that condition. On a somewhat similar front, a peculiar animal stands out as a cryptid in Maine that exhibits not only a rare shade of fur, but also mystical powers. Since the early 1890s, reports of an unusually massive moose have been passed on through generations by those who brave the Maine wilderness. To bring home a full-grown moose is an impressive feat in and of itself, but this one exceeds the term rarity. Instead, it's more of a phenomenon, crossing into territory most would deem paranormal. Not only was it classified as albino, already a highly sought-after kind of moose, but it was also much, much larger. Where a regular full-size moose stands 6 feet tall at the shoulder, the Specter Moose stands at a whopping 10 to 15 feet tall. Regular adult moose weigh around 800 to 900 pounds, whereas the Specter Moose is estimated to be near 2,500. Antler span on a normal moose is 4 to 6 feet wide. A Specter Moose's is 10 to 12, beyond its usual size. Witnesses have gotten close enough to spot details that only provide a stranger's perspective to the whole thing. It all began in 1891. Clarence Duffy was a hunting guide out of Old Town, Maine, a man well connected with the local wilderness and wildlife. According to the story, Clarence was taking a group of hunters out to the remote Lobster Lake as he usually did. Sometime along the journey, he noticed unusual movement by some underbrush near the lake. Getting behind some trees, Clarence carefully watched as the brush continued to rustle. What he saw was impossible. Emerging from the tall grass walked the largest moose the world had likely ever seen. He reported it to stand at least 13 feet tall with antlers about 10 feet wide. He was unsure about its exact color, but guessed it was either white or gray. You'd think an experienced hunter like Duffy viewed this as an opportunity to bring home a trophy that would probably make him world famous. He did for a moment, but was far too unnerved to raise his rifle. Instead, Clarence simply stayed hidden behind the trees and watched as the giant stomped through the forest. Once out of sight, Clarence Duffy quickly rushed back to town to tell everyone what he had just seen. Unfortunately, despite his credibility and proven knowledge, the fantastical tale about a freakishly large moose was too outlandish, even from a source as reliable as Duffy. Granted, it is a bold claim, even for hunters. Full-grown moose are already imposing enough, but one of this size? Simply ridiculous. They laughed at Duffy for the time being. Hearing this from one lone source just wasn't going to cut it. They wouldn't laugh for long though, because the story would soon be corroborated. That very same year, a lumberjack based out of Bangor by the name of John Ross served as the second credible sighting of the Specter Moose. Just a few months later, after Clarence Duffy's sighting, John was crossing between Big Lobster Lake and Little Lobster Lake when he saw the exact same thing. Noticing something strange moving in the dense woods just ahead, John moved just a bit closer until he saw exactly what Clarence saw: a giant white moose that stood at least 13 feet tall. The lumberjack was immediately overcome with fear, so he turned around and fled the area. After returning to town and letting people know of his encounter, the parallels between descriptions made Duffy's story sound a lot less mythical, especially since both experiences were only months apart. Both accounts aside, these retellings only provided a little buzz versus a full-blown spectacle. But as it stood, the seed of this mysterious Specter Moose had already been sown. The next recorded encounter produced a story on a more up-close and personal front. Yet again, that very same year, an unnamed hunter from New York was looking for game. Somewhere along the excursion, he encountered the large beast, likely being the first to ever see it closer than anyone else. The unnamed man said the moose was a little more than just white or albino, rather appearing fully pale and almost ethereal in appearance, like a ghost or spirit. Although scared, the hunter reacted differently than the previous men. Instead of turning around and heading back the way he came, the hunter raised his gun and fired a few shots into it. Although he'd shot it, the moose expressed no reaction to being hit, then began charging the man in retaliation. The hunter fled for his life with the giant moose following close behind. It chased him through the woods until he was forced to take shelter inside a bear cave. Exhausted and just barely escaping death, the man waited, absolutely terrified. Just outside, the Specter Moose was heard, stomping, pacing, angrily waiting for the man from New York to come back out. After an excruciating hour, the giant finally left the cave alone, giving the hunter room to escape. This account is straightforward, but missing more specific details, like the hunter's name or where exactly this retelling was published, if at all. But much like Clarence Duffy and his encounter, yet another story involving a second New York hunter came along to corroborate it. A hunter and sportsman by the name of Howard Van Ness likely serves as one of the most famous encounters with the Specter Moose of Maine. Just like our previous story, Howard traversed the state's northern wilderness, approximately 30 miles northeast of Norcross. He was traveling with a group of companions, and at some point, they got separated. Van Ness continued on his own for a while until he stumbled across the imposing creature. Ness described the moose's stature to be more in line with a large camel and weighing a ton. It was both amazing and spine-chilling to witness. And just like the hunter from the previous year, he raised his weapon and shot it. The bullet landed just above its shoulder, but it didn't fall, nor did it sense any danger. In fact, shooting it only made it angry. The Specter Moose rushed at Van Ness, sending him running for his life. Howard made a break for it, sprinting deeper into the woods with the moose galloping close behind, refusing to stop until he could find decent enough cover. Howard took a chance by hiding between a large tangle of fallen trees and branches, where he'd have a better chance of staying out of sight. Per his account, the giant moose still sensed that he was there, circling the area he was hiding with incredible speed, despite its size. Van Ness waited like this for a few terrifying moments, listening as the enraged beast stalked the dead branches ferociously. Then, getting tired of the hunt, it stopped. Howard Van Ness got one last look at the massive animal when it jumped directly over his hiding spot as it exited, demonstrating yet another impossible ability by a regular moose, especially one of this size. According to his report, Van Ness relayed that the moose, quote, weighed a ton and as tall as a camel, with magnificent head and antler. With this sighting, the legend of the Specter Moose was elevated to a level that caught the attention of hunters region-wide, causing the eyes of hunters to look a little more cautiously, if not more ambitiously. It remained dormant from human eyes for the next 3 years before it was seen again. In 1895, Granville Gray, a taxidermist from Bangor, caught a glimpse of it. It remained out of sight again until 1899, when a much closer look was had at the moose. A man from West Newbury, Massachusetts, named Gilman Brown, witnessed the moose himself near Roach River. He got a close enough look to count the points on one side of its antler. Normally, the limit on an antler points for moose is between 8 and 12, whereas Gilman Brown clearly counted 22 of them. After his observation, Brown aimed at the giant and fired 5 shots at it. But instead of chasing him, like the men before, it simply gave him an angry look before walking away. The Specter Moose's popularity continued to soar during the late 19th and early 20th century, providing one of the most mysterious phenomena in the North American wilderness, perhaps not as sensational as others, but still just as interesting. In fact, the moose was even mentioned in the November 1899 issue of the New York Times, describing it as an eerie and haunting presence in the wilderness. Folklore grew in popularity. In addition to the rise in sightings, other hunters mentioned more than just the creature's gargantuan size, but also otherworldly powers. If it wasn't apparent already, gunfire not only appears to leave the moose unharmed, but does little if no damage at all. These were experienced frontiersmen in an era with nothing close to what modern hunters can get their hands on. They knew lands like these, and they knew when the game was hit. But what if I told you, men cut from that same cloth said they saw the moose was glowing faintly like a spirit, walking through solid objects, and even disappearing? As the turn of the century marched onward, eyewitness reports resumed, and in higher numbers. More and more, it looked as if this moose was being seen by hunters and hikers alike, swearing undoubtedly that they had laid eyes on a massive but ghostly animal, with descriptions sounding more and more like the previous sighting. Interestingly, despite some of the close calls by overachieving hunters, a recurring trend appears that those who cross paths with the moose can get close, but never too close. Then again, that's all determined by whether or not the beast feels threatened. In 1906, a Sherman, Maine man, George Nealand, was biking the road between Sherman and Macwahock when he came dangerously close to it. He thought it was a horse at first, only to realize that it was a giant white moose. For once, this wasn't a situation where the creature was provoked by gunfire. Even still, it charged him. George didn't take the risk of outpacing the moose on his bicycle, but chose to instead find a nearby tree and climb as high as he could. True to the pattern so far, it lingered in the area for a moment, until losing interest and walking away. Up until this point, the encounter with Howard Van Ness proved to be the most credible, but other unnamed hunters have had close calls with the creature with similar results. Bullets never seem to harm the majestic giant, but there's yet another legend that tells of hunters who followed through with killing the beast. Or so they thought. It's unconfirmed, like many stories of the time, but supposedly a group of hunters near the Molunkus Stream in east-central Maine happened upon an unusually large white moose. Succumbing to its injuries this time, The hunters retrieved the carcass with intentions to skin and field dress it the next day. Just as the process calls for, the throat of the moose was cut and then hung upside down so the body could drain. The hunters called it a day with the impressive kill, and the men fell asleep. Come morning, they'd all be in for a shock. Wherever they decided to hang the moose for draining, it had miraculously disappeared. In truth, the only logical explanation for this disappearance lay in the hands of other greedy hunters, or maybe a just as hungry animal. But it still didn't make sense. Did someone really avoid waking a group of hunters while stealing an adult moose without making so much as a sound? It was a truly puzzling experience for them, but the men decided to move forward with their hunt. In all honesty, this would be the least bizarre experience they would have on that journey. They were down a unique white moose, but carried on the hunt. Just as normally as any day in the forest, everything was relatively normal. Unfortunately for them, the strangeness picked up again once the moon was high. As they were ending the day once again at their camp, they heard something approaching from the wilderness, something large. They had probably anticipated more large game accidentally wandering into their space, and if so, they'd be right. Just not this one in particular. Fit for something out of a morbid piece of fiction, there stood the previous white moose, freshly emerged from the brush. The hunters couldn't believe what they were seeing. Not only had such a rare specimen found the very people who shot it again, but also the beast's throat was still slit, as it was the night before. It was unfazed and walking normally, as if it had never been slain or lost any blood. It's as if this animal resurrected itself and escaped, only to search for those who killed it. Before anything else could happen, the hunters each raised their weapons and shot at the creature to drive it away, which it did, but not in the way of a startled animal. The moose, still being fired on, simply turned around and calmly walked away. Considering the paranormal abilities witnesses claim the Specter Moose already had, cheating death doesn't seem too far-fetched. That being said, this is the only known account where the moose was ever subdued, if even for a moment. The hunters had one last run-in with the beast, a staggering 90 miles north from when they last saw it. It was in Ashland where it was encountered again, scaring the group of men once more. Upon recognizing it, the hunters opened fire again, but to no effect. In 1938, a hunter named Houston even bore witness to the real-time comparison between the Specter Moose and its more regular-sized fauna. Whilst in the Chesuncook region near the west branch of the Penobscot River, he managed to see the beast with a herd of 16 other moose, consisting of 3 males watching over the females as they grazed. Among the 3 males, the moose stood freakishly larger than the rest. Houston saying this one, in particular, made the others, quote, look like pygmies. And not only was it large, but also white and ethereal looking. Perhaps it was just a rare sighting of an unusually massive member of the herd that happened to be albino or of a rare white coloration. To Houston's surprise, this was not the answer. The hunter looked back for a split second, and upon returning his gaze to the animals, the one that stuck out like a sore thumb was gone. As the next few decades carried on, the Specter Moose reared its head sporadically, sometimes avoiding sight for years, but every time it did, the same strange features would make their way back to the ears of locals. And with no definitive origin to call back to, anyone's guess was no more bizarre than the next. Some have even likened the Specter Moose to how some view the West Virginia Mothman, as an entity symbolizing impending doom, a harbinger of death or disaster. In 2002, a beloved restaurant in Franklin, Maine was sadly destroyed in a fire. This was after the moose was reportedly seen nearby just shortly before. It's only a theory, but legends around the world often tell of ghastly entities as being connected to unfortunate incidents, some bigger than others. Even after all these sightings and close encounters, no one seems to have the first idea of what the Specter Moose is or why it has these abilities. But it's clear that it's more than just local wildlife. Albino moose do indeed exist, although it's extremely rare. But thanks to the rash sightings over the years, the Specter Moose clearly had brown eyes, whereas albino moose retain a pinkish color. As stated before, no known explanations exist for this creature, not even recorded indigenous folklore to corroborate what we know. The beast lives amongst nature just like the rest of its brethren, that happens to harbor powers beyond our understanding. Were all those hunters simply wrong in what they saw? What exactly could it be? A spiritual protector of Maine's wilderness? An overblown tale? Or something more sinister? And if you're a hunter yourself, would you ever risk taking a shot at the Specter Moose?